and welcome to a VSA Capital video. I'm Ollie O'Donnell, Head of Research at VSA, and today I'm talking to Dan Kunz, CEO of Prime Mining. Thanks for talking to us, Dan. How are things across the Atlantic?
Doing well here. We're all anxious to get rid of this COVID stuff, but all good.
Well, I think that's exactly the same sentiment over here as well. Well, it's great to have you with us today, and Prime Mining is focused on the Los Reyes asset in Sinaloa in Mexico, gold-silver project that came to market about 18 months ago. Your share price is up 650% since the start of 2020, and you're now valued at about $200 million Canadian. Over that time, you've brought in an impressive management team, and it's recently been disclosed that you've brought in Pierre Lassonde as your cornerstone shareholder. So I guess the first question that really sets the scene for a short presentation is, what is it that attracted you and your original development team to the project, and what is getting the attention and the time and money of such experienced mining individuals?
Yes, so I think the first thing to start out with is that when we had the history of this company back and the asset was first acquired, there was a pretty significant effort to put it into production. And it was going to be a small scale heap leach. There have been historic studies done, both a PFS and a PEA. And in that work that was done, there was considerable amount of metallurgical test work, the standard approach for column testing for heap leaching, together with a second study that had a pretty extensive metallurgical test work program for milling. And with that background, with about 450 drill holes and enough of a resource there, it became an objective right out of the box for the very early Prime Mining company. In fact, we were called the Power Metals back then, and the name has been changed in concert with this entire new focus. And so we headed down that road, and I've been down to the site many times and looked it over. And when we got there, and I had a couple of geos with me, and we really took a hard look at it, we decided that there was a lot more to this story than meets the eye, and particularly the exciting nature of the property, an epithermal, structurally controlled deposit that had been rather marginally explored, in the sense that there was at least 60% or more of the structure that had yet to have any work done on it. And it was that, coupled with a few other facts, which I'll get into throughout the presentation, that really led us to believe that this property, this Los Reyes project, is really potentially much larger than the first look at it that was given. It always was profiled historically as a small scale underground mineable mine that might be in the 500,000 ounce category. What we've always known about it, it was an extremely high grade property. Back historically, all the way back to colonial era in the 1700s, when it was first mined, all the way up through the 1800s, and then mining stopped in about early 1900s, 1910. And throughout that era, it was small scale mining, but very, very high grade selective mining, meaning they were chasing some pretty high grade material. It's fair to say that, you know, the cutoff grades that they were mining were quite high. They were probably on the order of 15 to 30 gram range of that. Everything below would be waste or more. So when we started to look at the data and we started to try to put a model together on this thing, it became apparent to us that there is a significant amount of upside in this thing. And I might point it out on a couple of slides here. We do have a slide in here that shows some of these high grade intercepts. And what's pretty interesting about it, it's a high grade upside slide 13, and it's a list of all the historic drill holes, at least the ones in our database, that exceed 10 grams of gold or higher, and then the accompanying silver value. The other thing to remember is that this has a 26-to-1 silver to gold ratio. That's the current average. So it puts it in a pretty high value silver property as well. So with those two things and a lot of due diligence by the Trinity Capital partners, when they took a look at it, and they do a lot of work, and that's Pierre Lassonde's group, they're invested in a few other things. So they have a strong technical orientation as well. they saw the same thing. So it's a pretty exciting play, and that's the focus for us, is to pause the production scenario and move now toward expanding exploration. And we're currently drilling as we speak.
Excellent. Well, we've certainly been impressed by what we've seen so far. So let's dive into the presentation.
Sounds good. So I'm going to just start with the caution slide. We do have a disclaimer here that I may be making forward-looking statements, of course. And so the slide presentation opens up with a slide deck, the slide named "An Evolving Company." We think that really does tell an important message to potential investors, and that is that it has evolved rather quickly from, as I was saying, this notion that it could be a small-scale heap leach mine, and we now know that the evolution is going to move toward a much larger scale properties. If you were to take all three categories, measured, indicated, and inferred, and take the silver values and turn them into gold, we're in excess of 1.1 million ounces at about a 1.3 gram per ton. So it's important for us to see how much bigger that's going to be, because if we start down a path of production, it's likely that we want to ensure that we have the right scale before we get started. So we have a high quality asset, as we say in our slide deck. It's one of the highest grade pure oxide open pit resources around these days, particularly with the gold and silver values being so significant. We do have 633,000 ounces measured and indicated gold and 16.6 million ounces M&I silver. And as I said earlier, this is just the beginning. The other evolution on the company is we see that down dip and along strike, and particularly outside of the known resource areas, there's a significant opportunity to add to this resource through the old-fashioned way of pure exploration. We're studying the modeling, we're looking at the deposition environment, we're understanding some of the alteration patterns, and as we do that, we're getting more and more able to go to where we should be drilling. You did mention, Ollie, that we have a strong management team. That was a deliberate effort as well to focus on all three important categories in a management team, and corporate governance at the top of it. We have an independent board, very seasoned and very, very active in the company's fortunes and future. By no means any kind of a rubber stamp board. We have a very strong technical team headed by Kerry Sparks, recently joining us from his days with actually a Lassonde company known as Franco-Nevada, a very successful royalty company. And Kerry's also co-founder of Orla, another investment of the Trinity Group. And Orla is currently building a mine in Mexico. So he has a strong background that's quite significant and quite important and relevant to what we're doing. On the cap table, our capitalization is now, as you mentioned earlier, is around 200 million Canadian. If you kind of turn that into US, that's a 150 million value. And I always look at it this way: if you take our all-in ounces at this point at 1.1 million, that's about $140 an ounce US. A property of this size that could be going multi-million ounce with a pure oxide, high-grade nature to it, we see several $100 an ounce easily. This is clearly still very undervalued. And even though this has had a significant run from its early days, as you said, up a significant percentage since our beginning, that's the fact that this was never really understood. And I think out of the box, we were rather undervalued. We're still undervalued today, in our opinion. We have a long way to go. And if this starts to approach 2 million ounce all-in resource, let's say, something along those lines, you can see the math gets rather exciting from that point. We're sitting on about 7 million in cash today. That's active, allows us to fund our active program. We do have some in-the-money warrants, and those are starting to be exercised, and that funding would bring it about another 7 million. So we're very well positioned to go forward on our program. I'll go quickly through the board. There's a slide here on our board of directors, and it's headed by Murray John. It's great to be working with Murray again. I first worked with him when I was a CEO of Ivanhoe Mines. This is the first one, and we were raising a significant amount of capital for a property in Mongolia, Oyu Tolgoi. And so when I was doing that, he was with Dundee, and Now Murray is involved quite a bit with other companies, specifically Discovery Metals. They're actively exploring in Mexico as well. So he brings a lot of a wealth of resource actually in his skills and his governance and so on, and particularly with that Mexico influence and importance. I'd like to mention Andy Bowering is specifically. Andy could be considered a founder of the company. He's a pretty savvy market guy, a lot of strengths across the board, understanding investors' needs, looking at putting together structures that work, and also, actively managing with me, co-managing this company. So we form a pretty strong team, and it's great to be working with Andy. We have the other 3 board members. I mentioned Paul Larkin, Paul Sweeney, and then Mark Prefontaine. Mark is a co-founder of Orla as well, brings a lot of direct experience. He's a professional geologist. So as you can see with this mix, pretty strong, pretty experienced in terms of the direct relevant experience in Mexico. So I think we come to the table with a lot of strength. Our management team slide is the next one as well. And I did mention a few of the team there. This is a strong, similarly Mexico relevant team. So name I mentioned earlier was Kerry Sparks. I also mentioned Ian Harkis, but I would want to also point out that we have Mario Castellanos. Mario is our project manager in Mexico. He's a resident there. He puts a team together there, and that allows us to operate in these COVID times with continued ability to go to the site and be active there. We're operating under a very careful situation and managing our activities there. And so with Mario on site and his many, many years of experience, it gives us a real first-rate on-site team that allows us to continue our work. And now with the drilling we're doing, he's got a strong set of local guys and national geologists and so on. And so it's a real strong local team as well. We've got a good relationship with our community and our social license. So we continue to focus on trying to maximize that relationship as well. The next slide is a pretty interesting one in terms of its location. This property couldn't be better located in terms of the infrastructure around it. There's water, power, rail. There's populations for workforce. It's just a 2-hour drive north of the city of Mazatlan on paved, considered interstate highways, and then about a 45-minute drive into the site from Kosala. So I would also point out in this slide that we now own 100% of this. You may have seen the most recent news release. We made a payment to Vista. We have one more to go, but they used to have an NSR, a royalty on it, as well as a right to back in to 49% of the underground. And all of that has been extinguished, and now this is 100% prime mining. There is slide 10 shows the concession boundary, and what we have here is a pretty large size concession, but you'll see on that slide some squiggly, ovally looking shapes, and those are the 8 areas where the current resource is made up. So this is a multi-deposit area, and eventually we're starting to see those connecting together where the structures are just connected, but they haven't had any drilling. Here we have a resource that was issued, an independent NI 43-101 compliant resource that was issued in April of the past year. And it shows a 0.22 cutoff. Those economics are open pit, whittle pit driven for this kind of operation, but they're also driven off of heap leach recoveries of 74% gold and only 25% silver. However, the higher grade, if you look at, say, the 0.7 cutoff, that might represent material that could be run through a mill, everything that grade and higher. And so those recoveries would be more like in the mid 90s, say 95% gold, and the mid 80s on silver. So a big difference. And therefore, this combination for efficiency will be something that we'll be continuing to look at. I do want to point out on the next slide, there's a focus here on the high grade upside potential of the property here as we look at this existing data set. And as I said, as we look at where we're going in the future down off of structural areas that have little or no work done on them, and we're starting to map and do some sampling and that kind of thing. And what we're seeing is the opportunity to find higher grade shoots here. This cross-section slide, it's actually a long section through the Zapote and Tahoe Nidas area. That's the westernmost area. And you can see where if you divide the data sets into, just basically let the data talk to us, and there's zones where you've got gold, you've got high-grade silver, and then you got high-grade gold and silver. And you can start to see where these shoots form, and the higher grade opportunities would be just below them, some targets down dip on some of these structures. The other thing is that this is a very structurally controlled environment. If you go to the next slide, you can see the sense of that, where the sort of red color spider webbing looking thing that goes through there is the structure itself is known as a horsetail, where it kind of breaks up the central feature on into these splays that go off, and they all seem to exhibit the same genesis of mineralization, but it's apparent to us in the data that there may be pulses where several different events came through, and you've got higher grade zones that occur in those pulses, and we're starting to see those patterns develop. And that's pretty important as we start to look at where this is going in the future and how to drill it and what to be looking for. So we have a drill program that's focusing on those ovals, those yellow ones in there, and then there's the blue sky potential, if you want to call it that, the undrilled areas that have the rectangles around them. And now it's starting to expand well more to the east as we see opportunities out there unfolding. So the property is getting bigger, even from our original conception of how big it may be, in the sense that we're now knowing more about the property, using our technical data and our strengths to be able to look for important areas. There's a slide called the path forward. This talks about our approach, the three-pronged approach. We are doing a 15,000 meter drilling program that will focus in the first box on upgrading the existing indicated. So remember, got measured, indicated, and then the inferred category. We'll be moving the inferred up to measured and indicated with some drilling. And the second box are the expansion potentials we have in the drilling along strike and down dip. That's ongoing as we speak. We're drilling into some of those areas. You can look at those as those yellow oval areas in the previous slide. And then the third areas are some of these new areas, which may be represented by those rectangular boxes on the previous slide, as well as some additional areas that we're unfolding now. So with this program underway, we've got 2 drills turning right now. We have 2 more on the way to the property. And so ultimately we'll have 4. The third one is expected any day now, and then the fourth one behind that. The next slide talks a little bit about some of the work we've done, and you can go through that and look at the mapping and sampling. I want to emphasize how important that's been, and it continues to be. And we also have been going through all of the existing core. There's 89 core holes, about 13,000 meters of core that exists, is being relogged. We're using scanning technology to help us understand the alterations in there. And then those alteration types compared to the associated assay grades gives us a bit of a roadmap on where we're going. So that work continues. It's a very important part of it. We have mention a statement of metallurgy. We're comfortable with the work that's been done in the past. We're doing a little bit on this program, but it's only, it's pretty minor, just focusing on a few things. So there won't be a lot of met work done yet. And then logistically, we're expecting this drilling to continue on through Q2 of this year. And so we've got a pretty busy next 2 quarters in front of us.
Brilliant. Thanks for the overview, Dan. So let's do a couple of questions to follow up on that. You mentioned the experience that you've got in Mexico and that your team already has. Obviously, mining is a huge part of the Mexican economy, and it's well known for its geology. How do you see it as a jurisdiction? Because it has slipped back in the rankings a little over the last few years. And how are you using that previous experience to counterbalance that?
Yes, so we do have a strong base of experience in the country, as I outlined at my own personal 17 years with Chesapeake Gold Corp. And I was lead independent director, so I was in and out of Mexico a great deal and have a pretty good working understanding. And as you said, it is a continued challenge as administrations come and go, both here in the U.S. and in Mexico, and there's that relationship back and forth. There are other issues regarding security, their economy, but overall, it's still a very major part of the country's economy. And as such, they've designated it during these COVID times as a necessary industry. It's well supported by the business community and the people in general in Mexico. So while we'll see different various slippages in its rating and so on, I think overall it still continues to be a rather significant part of their economy, and as such, it's still ranked rather highly comparatively to other countries for mining. And so while it maybe has lost its real high position, it's still pretty solidly ranked. So we'll continue to work as we do. We're careful with following the changing rules and the laws and working with the communities and just being a good citizen. And as such, it's the best we can do. So we'll continue to do that.
Yeah, and you got an agreement with the local ejidos, which has a much longer term than most of them that I've seen.
Well, that's true. We deliberately set out to engage the local ejido. These are people who have rights to the surface in the areas that we're exploring and eventually will be mining, and they have agricultural interests and so on in that area. And so what we do is we work with them to develop something that works for both sides. And for us, what we wanted was stability in a longer term agreement. Some folks go in there and have a couple of years agreement, and then they're back in and having to renegotiate and so on. And while that's fine, we saw a different need here. What we wanted was that stability throughout the term of a 15-year agreement with the rights to another 15 years. And that only works if the deal's fair. And so inside of that is a graduated series of payments. So during exploration, it's one thing, and during construction, it's another, and during operations, it's another, obviously escalating in value to the ejido. Any disturbance we do to the crops and the land, we pay for, and we properly compensate for that. And so those kinds of relationships, we've taken a focus on hiring from this local ejido as many people as we can from the local area, so to speak. We also, work to be a good very much.
Mm. And we touched on some of the recent news flow in the presentation just then. But the project at the moment looks like an open pit project. But our experience from an analytical standpoint suggests that these type of epithermal deposits carry on at depth, and the grades tend to strengthen at depth. So having brought forward that payment and brought out those backing rights, how significant do you think the underground potential is?
We think that actually could be the real prize here. And as you said, these systems are known to be well plumbed at depth. If you understand where you're in this column, stratigraphy column in terms of the epithermal type model, you have a boiling zone, you have the upper zones where there's high grade bonanza deposits. They can be several 100 meters thick, and so and we think we understand about where that's at. But what's the depth, we can't say. Because there's no data, there's no drilling, et cetera. But if you look at some comparatives in Palmarejo, which Coeur d'Alene has, and you start to understand those systems, they're quite deep seated, and they transition into sulfide, high grade sulfide below that. So there's no reason to think that this deposit doesn't have that kind of potential. There's no indication otherwise, and frankly, because there's no data that deep, that's kind of the exciting part of this in some ways, is that we can get a drill bit into a little deeper into this stratigraphy and see what it is that's going on at depth. That could open up a whole new future for this deposit. And while it'll likely be open pit mine first, in my career I've been involved in mines that off the bottoms of pits that are mined out, you drive an adit in and you start to underground mine. And so it's very common. It also could be, the development schedule would be that you'd open up underground mine and somewhere else out on the eastern end and mine it along with the open pit. I don't know. There's a lot of good a lot of good opportunities here. So for us, it's I think one of the secret values, you might call it, or one of the places we're going to pursue to try to understand at depth the real potential here. Is it another Palmarejo? Is it another, look at what Orla is doing. It's a little different kind of deposit, but Camino Rojo there, they've got about 1 million ounces of oxide they're putting into production now, but they're sitting on 9.5 million ounces of sulfide below. So these systems, as you say, can be very deeply seated, and who knows, big upside.
And at the moment, it does sound like a lot of the exploration you're doing is sort of early stage grunt work. But you've also discussed the fact that previous owners have conducted PFS studies, PEAs, Vista Gold mapped out where they wanted to put the heap leach pads. What can you use from those previous studies, and is actually prime miming much further forward in its development than simply expanding its resource?
Well, I think that's a great question, Ollie, because we really, as I said, we went down the path to pursue production. In fact, that's the strength of my background. I've operated and built mines my whole early part of my career with MK Gold and other companies. And so we I really assessed that, and we looked hard at the whole property in that sense. We looked at the heap leach pad areas. My engineers took a redesign and redesigned a heap that would take on 30 million tons. And so we were headed in that direction. And I think we will continue to have a kind of realization that this property will be put into production, and it will be sooner rather than later. So to that end, we are pursuing an active permitting program. So we're doing baseline work with the idea that we'll cover the entire area with a full baseline survey. We're going through that entire exercise, pursuing an operating permit. And in Mexico, you can do that. We can get an overall permit in place and still be working on the resource. And so what we're really saying, what they are, is what's the maximum amount of disturbance that you might be involved in. So we'll continue to pursue that, and we have a lot of very relevant data from those two previous studies, particularly the metallurgical work. But there's a number of other things we have, including some of their baseline work, that has been helpful, and so on. So I think that the property will have a profile of ultimately an operating property, but there's a bit of a pause, I think you could call it, over the next period of time, and it's hard to say how long. Certainly 2021 for sure, and I'd say it'd be a good problem to have is if we're also pausing in 2022 for additional drilling, because it just means the resource is getting that much larger. And you want to start with a pretty good understanding of what it is you're going to develop before you set about developing it.
And the experience you've talked about, your team, it sounds like yourself and them all have the experience to put it into production. But if you look at their CVs as well, they've made sales of assets to Barrick, to Vale, and to a number of others. So you've also got that option. Which do you think is your preference?
I think that the likelihood is that this will command some sort of premium and be a takeout of some kind, a candidate for that in the future. And I say that because I know that the appetite for some of the producing companies for high quality assets like this is pretty high, and rightfully so. These don't come along every day. And if you have a reasonably large resource where it matters to, I don't know, I could pick any number of names here, Agnico, Eagle, and others, but so, you need to be a resource that would move their needle. And as we start to approach beyond where we're at now and some sort of doubling, let's say, or something along those lines, then that's an important asset, and it still is today. But I think if you look forward to where we're in the future, it's very likely that that's a strong possibility rather than a development scenario. But we won't be, our hands won't be tied there. We'll continue to work toward a goal of putting this into production and do all the things necessary to keep that path active and viable. And if no one is interested in it and we end up putting it in production, it'll surprise me, but it's certainly something we could do.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I mean, I think you've touched on it through a lot of the answers you've given in the presentation as well. And that there's upside through expansion of the resource and through de-risking of the project as you advance towards through development. But what do you see as the key catalysts over the next sort of 12 months that are going to realize that additional value?
Well, one of the key things when you're drilling a 15,000 meter program doesn't sound like a lot, but on a small structurally controlled property like this, it's a significant amount of drilling. It's all going to be core drilling, and it'll be very, very helpful for us to have our own core to work with. While there are core holes available to us, most of this drilling was RC drilling. Most of the historic stuff was 450 or so drill holes, of which only 89 of them were core holes. We also studied the variability between core and RC, and there really isn't a lot of variability. But what's important is the rock types, the alterations, the structural, so that we can get a stronger feel for where we're at in this system. We think we're starting to unfold now, but the further east we go, we think the higher in the original depositional stratigraphy we are, and as such, the bonanza zones, if you want to call them that, in these epithermal environments, may still be very close to us in terms of where we're at, and that also would suggest that it's even deeper. The potential is even deeper for that sulfide component if it's there. So a lot to be learned in the first 6 months of this year with our program, the 15,000 meters. And if we pause to do a resource update, that'll be determined at the time if we think that's the data warrants that, or if what we may learn from this is that we're going to then ramp up additional drilling, and it's likely we'll start to return to core drilling and fill this thing in. So for me, I think the release of our news release flow will be a real important part of this to understand how this is growing, where it's going, what kind of grades we're getting. Is it still high grade? Is it even higher grade? And are we starting to get into some of those bonanza zones and so on? So I think there's a significant value add along the way that has very little to do with ultimately the size of this resource. And so it's unlocking that. We hope to be able to disclose that well in our news releases to the shareholders, and try to make sure that people understand, what this drilling is really doing for this property.
Excellent. Well, I mean, I could ask plenty more questions, but I think we'll probably have to wrap up there. But thanks very much, Dan, for taking the time to talk to us, and perhaps just give us a final quick summary of why prime mining.
Why prime mining? Because it's evolving, and it's evolving from a small scale, misunderstood, semi-focused company to now totally focused, understanding the asset, evolving with a strong management team, a strong financial backing, and very much a technical emphasis on a single property. It's gold and silver, and in this economy, with the silver value, the optionality of silver is hugely important. And then finally, I think what is the important thing here is that it's still very much undervalued. And so don't let the chart dissuade you because you think you might have missed something. You will be looking back at this time saying the same thing. So undervalue, evolving company.
Fantastic. Thanks for your time, Dan.
Very good. Thank you, Ollie. All the best.